Design is visual communication. It's imperative as designers that we understand how to communicate as effectively as possible to ensure that our message is understood. To do that, we start with communication theory. In today's session, we're going to be looking at communication as a process and looking at the linear process model. So to kick us off, we've got Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver, and they developed the mathematical theory of communication. Now, I know that that sounds totally dull, but it's known as the mother of all communication theory. And it basically is a theory that illustrated how to compress and send as much information down a channel as possible without losing essential parts that affect the meaning of the message. So I'm going to say that again. Compress and send as much information down a channel as possible without losing essential parts that affect meaning. Now, these two blokes worked for the Bell Telephone Laboratory, so it's about telephone communication, but it's a good place to start this linear process model. So simplified, their theory goes something like this. You have an information source and that transmits a message via a channel. The transmitter converts that and encodes the message into a signal. It's received and decoded before reaching its destination. So you've got information source, transmitter, receiver, destination. So a phone conversation would go something like this. Somebody's got some news to tell a friend, so they use a telephone, and the telephone encodes the message into radio waves and sends it down as a signal. That signal is received at the other end with a telephone that decodes the message and it reaches its audience. It's decoded and reaches its destination, which is the other person on the end of the phone. Simple. Hello, straight down the line. So using this theory, can we identify for designers where the designer sits in that model, where the client sits in that model, where the audience sits in the model, and where the media outlet sits in that model? Let's have a look together. So we've got an information source. Who's the source of the information? In this instance, it's the client. The client has got a job. Let's say that it's for an editorial illustration. So the client knows what the article is. They get in touch with the illustrator via email and say to them, we've got an article about British values. Can you create as an illustration around that? They're using the designer as the transmitter of that message. The designer is encoding that message into visual form. The illustrator is turning it into a picture. The receiver is the media outlet. Now, there's various kinds of media outlets. You could have a TV program, you could have a magazine, you could have a book cover, you could have product packaging, you could have a website. All of these things are media outlets. In this instance, it's a magazine. So the magazine is the media outlet, and that is the receiver. It goes into a magazine and it reaches its destination, and the destination is the audience that picks up the magazine and reads it and hopefully buys it. Now, what problems can you identify with this theory? The theory is a little bit like taking a tin can. I don't know if you did this at school. You took a tin can with a piece of string and another tin can, and you talked to somebody through the tin can. And they could hear you. It's amazing. So you go in through the tin can, down the line to the other person. So it's linear. It goes from here, down the line to here. From here, down the line to here. And it's understood. Let's imagine it in a different way. Let's imagine that you've got a paper aeroplane and you write a message on the paper aeroplane, and it's a specific message to a specific receiver. So you're sending it to a specific person. So you put that message on, you put to Bob, let's go out for a drink on Friday night, lots of love, Dave. Fold it up, throw it to that. So Bob throws it to Dave, it flies through and Dave catches it. Okay, beautiful. What problems could occur between Bob throwing the aeroplane and Dave catching it? Well, let's imagine that they're outside and it's windy. So that letter gets thrown out and blown away somewhere else. Or that the letter's thrown out and it swerves around and somebody else catches the letter. Or the aeroplane, it's raining and the aeroplane gets wet and all the words that have been written on as the message get kind of melded together and degraded, and so you can't quite read the message properly. Or it's sent, there's a massive gust of wind, the aeroplane goes up in the sky, travels all the way to Spain, and a Spanish person picks up the aeroplane, reads it, it's all in English, can't speak a word of English, can't be understood. Now, in design terms and in communication theory, if you've got the line, imagine that I've got the two tin cans, and then I start twanging the line between the two tin cans. What's going to happen to the message? So that interference between the message and the receiver, the sender and the receiver down the line, is known in communication theory as noise. Now, for a designer and an illustrator, what could be the noise for a designer or an illustrator or an advertiser? Let's go for advertising. So I've created an advert. So I'm the information source, I'm an advertising director, and we're sending out the advert. It's going on ITV tonight. It's going out at 6 o'clock at night because that's when my target audience are watching telly. It's transmitted through a TV, but in between the advert being sent and the receiver, the audience watching it, they're sat down eating their dinner and they're distracted. They're talking to the friends. The kid, they've got a child. He's just knocked over a vase. There's a knock at the door with somebody selling them something at the door, and so they get like an interference between the message being sent and the audience receiving it, and that's known as noise. As designers, our job is to try and minimise as much of that noise as possible. And with advertising, that's why advertising adverts are repeated and repeated and repeated to make sure it gets past that noise and it's embedded into your memory. Now, as graphic designers and illustrators, we're generally working with imagery and typography. So there's other kind of elements of noise that we need to avoid. And as student designers, if you're a student, then there's even more to think about. So if you're studying a graphic design or an illustration course, who is your target audience? You've kind of got two target audiences, your client and your target audience. You have a target audience for what the piece is for. So if it was like a 40-year-old woman who likes horse riding, that could be your target audience. But you've also got a target audience that you've got to bear in mind that's not necessarily quite overt. And that is your tutors, the people who are going to mark your work. So you're communicating to them because you want to get good grades and you want to get, a good degree or a good qualification, but as well as the brief itself and the target audience attached to the brief. So your client in that situation is probably your tutor, and they also are making a value judgment about it. So you've got to do a few things to make sure that you communicate what you want about your work. So that means that you're trying to communicate to them that it's worth a first or a distinction, which means that it's thorough, that your research is thorough, that if you're annotating, it's spell checked properly, that the work you submit is professionally mounted, it isn't buckled, you haven't used Pritt stick, you've used spray mount, so it isn't that kind of bubbling through the work. That's that kind of noise that designers will get. So you've got poor quality printing, you've got the audience is distracted, you've got a wrong target audience, so you're using the wrong language or the wrong font or the wrong image or the wrong mood or the wrong style, and you might have spelling mistakes in your work. If you've got spelling mistakes in your work, that's going to kill your communication because it's going to make you look stupid. It's going to make you look like you're not thorough enough and that you don't care enough about the audience to actually spell check your work. So that's going to knock you down. Even if you're not marked against spelling, it's still going to have a psychological effect on the person marking your work. And if you're doing it out there for an actual real audience, you're working on a job at a design agency and you send something out with a spelling mistake, that is not only going to make the agency look stupid, it's not only going to make you look like a complete amateur, but it's also going to cost money. You're going to have to recall the print run, send it to print. That all costs money that you can't afford. Or you bite the bullet and send it out with a typo. So now I've got a question for you. Who controls the message and the meaning of the message? Well, that's really a trick question. It comes in two parts. Who controls the message and who controls the meaning of the message? So who controls the message? Is it the designer who controls the message because they're designing it, or is it the clients who controls the message? Now, we could argue all day about it, but really what it comes down to is a collaboration between the client and the designer or the illustrator. So the client might be very direct and tell the designer or the illustrator, this is what I want, and you become almost like a drawing machine for them. Or ideally, it's more of a collaboration and it's a back and forth process. But both of you own the message itself. You're crafting the message together. But you've got to remember, as a designer and an illustrator, you're working for the client. They're the people you need to please. It's their vision that you're trying to achieve for them that they can't do themselves. Who controls the meaning of the message is different. The meaning behind that message, it doesn't matter how much what I want to say in my message, the meaning of that message sits with the audience. Imagine a situation where you send a text message to someone and you're trying to be funny, a little bit sarcastic, and you send a message and they get offended by it. And oh no, you've opened up a can of worms and you're trying to explain yourself, I'm sorry, it was just a text, I was joking, I didn't mean it that way, I didn't realise it could be read that way, and it's all kinds of problems. It doesn't matter what your intentions are for that message, you need to communicate as clearly and effectively as possible to make sure it's understood in the way that you want it to be understood, in the way, at the time and in the manner, so that you get the results that you're looking for out of that communication. The meaning of your communication is in the response that you get from that communication. So be really clear, find out what your message is, who the audience is, okay? And that moves us on to a little story that I've got for you. This is going to help you to kind of understand how to ensure your communication is understood. There's a brand new multi-billion pound office building created in London. It's the night before the opening. The floor has been laid and it is swanky. It's like state-of-the-art flooring. It's cost £1 million for this floor to be put in. In the middle of the night, a 10-stone model walks through that room. She's wearing high-heeled shoes and she walks a 5-ton elephant around the room. She does it 3 times and leaves. In the morning, the only evidence that anybody came into the room were little dots on the floor. And so somebody knows that somebody's been in the room. There's no evidence at all that a 5-ton elephant has walked around the room. Why? It's simple. The 10-stone model is standing on stiletto heels and all of her weight is concentrated on 2 points. It's focused on those 2 points and it has a deep impact into the ground because of that pressure. The elephant, might be 5 tons of elephant, is spread equally across 4 feet and it's spread out evenly, and so it doesn't, because the surface area is larger, it doesn't have the same amount of impact. Now imagine that as your communication. If you try and target your communication to all women of all ages in all countries, you're spreading that message so thinly across that it will have no impact at all. That's why we have target audiences. If you can niche down your target as tightly as possible, the more and more focus you get, the deeper the impact will be. What does that mean for you as a designer? That means that you need to make sure that you target your communication as closely as possible to your audience. Find out how they like to be communicated to, where they like to be communicated to, what language they like, what style of font, what sort of colours they like, what should the style of the copy be. Imagine you go to a fair and there's 3 ducks on a shooting range and you've got 1 bullet. 3 ducks, 1 bullet. How many ducks can you hit with 1 bullet? Now these ducks are linear, they're laid out in front of you left to right. They aren't stacked up against each other. How many ducks can you shoot with 1 bullet? You can only shoot 1 duck at a time, only 1. So make sure that you only concentrate on 1 target audience with 1 message at a time to make sure you have the most impact. Stop spreading yourself thinly. So that is communication as a process, and we've looked at the linear process model. In the next video, we're going to be looking at semiotics and broadening out our understanding of how images are read. Until then, happy designing.